Ladies and gentlemen, let's start with the truth many of us avoid. Change isn't easy. I know this because years ago I sat on my couch, surrounded by unopened bills and half-finished projects, feeling like my life was a half-written book collecting dust. I remember the weight of it, the feeling that I had somehow wandered so far off course that finding my way back seemed impossible. I told myself tomorrow I'll get it together, but tomorrow came and went again and again. And here's what I want to tell you about those moments. They don't define you. They don't have to be the end of your story. But what does define you is whether you're willing to face them. The truth is, most of us spend our energy avoiding what hurts. We avoid looking at the numbers in our bank accounts. We avoid hard conversations. We avoid mirrors, literal or metaphorical, because we're terrified of what we might see staring back at us. And the longer we avoid it, the heavier it gets. But something shifted for me that day. I did something radical. I sat down, looked in the mirror, and said this isn't who I want to be. And that single moment of honesty, it wasn't loud or dramatic, changed everything. Because owning my story meant I could finally stop running from it. Now, let me be clear, owning your story doesn't mean you have to love every chapter. It doesn't mean you need to slap a positive spin on the messiness of your past or pretend the hard parts didn't happen. It means you face it all exactly as it is and decide you're not done writing yet. I think about it like this. Imagine you're standing in front of a blank page, pen in hand. But instead of writing, you're erasing, scratching out words, sentences, even entire paragraphs because they feel too raw or too real. At some point, you've erased so much that the page is empty, and you don't even know where to begin anymore. The problem is, we can't rewrite a story we're unwilling to read. We can't change what we refuse to name. And I get it, naming things can be terrifying. Calling out the ways we've played small, let people down, or let ourselves down doesn't feel empowering. It feels exposing. Vulnerable. But here's the truth, vulnerability isn't weakness. Vulnerability is how we take our power back. And it starts with asking the hard questions, the ones we avoid when we're busy scrolling, binge watching, or saying I'll deal with it later. Questions like, where am I stuck? What am I pretending isn't broken? What's the story I keep telling myself that's keeping me here? I asked myself those questions, and let me tell you, it wasn't pretty. I realized I was playing it safe because I was afraid of failing publicly. I was holding on to toxic relationships because letting go felt lonelier than staying. I was so busy keeping up appearances that I was neglecting the person I actually wanted to be. And seeing it all laid out in front of me was brutal, but it was also the moment I stopped hiding. Owning my story didn't fix everything overnight, but it gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time: freedom. Freedom to stop pretending. Freedom to admit I wanted more. Freedom to take responsibility and move forward instead of waiting for someone else to fix it for me. And that's what I want you to hear most of all. Freedom doesn't come from having it all figured out. It comes from telling the truth about where you are right now, even if it's messy, especially if it's messy. So let me ask you this: what parts of your story are you still running from, and what might happen if instead of running, you sat down and faced them? Because here's what I know: change doesn't start with a perfect plan or the right timing. It starts with radical honesty, the kind that feels scary and uncomfortable and just a little bit impossible. But here's the thing about impossible: it's just something that hasn't been tried yet. And you're stronger than you think. So start here, start with your story, and trust that the rest will follow. Here's the thing about patterns: they're sneaky. They show up in the smallest, most unassuming ways. They disguise themselves as habits, preferences, or even comforts, but if we're not careful, they can become chains. For me, those patterns look like scrolling on my phone late into the night and waking up exhausted. It looked like saying yes to every invitation because I didn't want to disappoint anyone, even though it left me feeling completely drained. It looked like spending money I didn't have because I convinced myself that new things would somehow make me feel more whole. And the hardest part: most of those patterns didn't even feel bad at first. They felt normal, harmless even. But patterns are like rivers. They carve out paths in our lives, and over time, those paths get deeper and harder to change. Breaking them isn't just about discipline, it's about disrupting the flow. It's about realizing that the current is taking you somewhere you don't want to go and being brave enough to step out, even when the water feels comfortable. I remember the first time I decided to break one of my patterns. It wasn't glamorous or Instagram worthy. I simply set my alarm 15 minutes earlier. That's it, just 15 minutes. And let me tell you, when that alarm went off the next morning, my first instinct was to hit snooze. My brain immediately started bargaining with me. It's just 15 minutes, it won't matter. But here's what I've learned about change: it's never about the size of the step. It's about the intention behind it. That morning I got out of bed, not because I felt motivated, but because I wanted to prove to myself that I could. And that single act, as small as it was, sent a message to the part of me that doubted whether I was capable of change. It said, watch me. That's the thing about patterns. They don't have to be massive to shape your life, and they don't have to be massive to change it either. Small choices, repeated consistently, create momentum. And momentum, it's magic. It builds on itself. That 15-minute alarm turned into journaling for 10 minutes. That journaling turned into a clearer headspace. That clearer headspace led to better decisions during the day. And those decisions started compounding until suddenly my life looked completely different. And it all started with one choice. But let's be honest, breaking patterns isn't always smooth. Sometimes you'll slip back into old habits. I know I did. There were mornings I hit snooze, nights I stayed up too late, days I scrolled endlessly instead of doing what I promised myself I would. And every time the shame would creep in, whispering, see, you're not strong enough to change. But here's what I want you to remember. Breaking patterns isn't about perfection. It's about persistence. It's about recognizing when you veered off course and gently, without shame, guiding yourself back. Because the truth is, setbacks aren't signs that you've failed. They're signs that you're trying. I used to think change required a complete overhaul, a massive, overnight transformation. But what I've learned is that it's less about burning everything down and more about planting seeds. It's about asking yourself, what can I do today that my future self will thank me for? Maybe it's drinking one more glass of water. Maybe it's setting your phone down 30 minutes before bed. Maybe it's finally having that hard conversation you've been avoiding. Whatever it is, don't underestimate the power of starting small. When we think about changing our lives, we often picture the end result, the career, the relationship, the confidence, but we forget that all of those things are built in the quiet moments when no one is watching. They're built in the choices we make when it's just us and our reflection in the mirror. I'll never forget the day I looked back and realized how far I'd come. It wasn't a monumental moment. There were no fireworks or applause. I was just sitting at my kitchen table, writing in my journal, and it hit me I didn't feel stuck anymore. And it wasn't because my life was suddenly perfect. It was because I had proven to myself over and over again that I was capable of showing up. So if you're feeling overwhelmed by the idea of change, let me remind you of this. You don't have to fix everything at once. You just have to take one step, disrupt one pattern, make one small, brave choice. Because when you do, you're not just changing your habits, you're changing the story you tell yourself about who you are and what you're capable of. And that's where real transformation begins. Courage isn't being fearless. It's showing up despite the fear. That's something I had to learn the hard way, because for a long time I thought courage was about confidence. I thought it was something other people had, people who looked fearless, who didn't second guess themselves, who walked into rooms like they belonged there. But when I finally decided to start changing my life, I realized courage has nothing to do with feeling ready and everything to do with showing up even when you don't. I'll never forget the first time I put myself out there in a way that felt completely vulnerable. I had signed up for a writing workshop, a dream I'd been holding on to for years but had been too afraid to pursue. I remember walking into that room, my hands shaking and my stomach in knots. The stories I was carrying in my head were loud. You don't belong here. Who do you think you are? They're going to figure out you're a fraud. That's the thing about fear. It doesn't whisper. It shouts. It tries to keep us small, because somewhere along the way we learned that small felt safer. And that day, every instinct I had was telling me to leave, to run before anyone had the chance to see me fail. But I stayed. I sat down. I picked up my pen. And you know what? I didn't write the best story in that room. My sentences weren't perfect. My dialogue needed work. But I wrote. I showed up, even though I felt exposed. That's what courage looks like. It's messy. It's uncomfortable. It's vulnerable. And that's exactly why it's so powerful. Because vulnerability doesn't weaken us. It connects us. It reminds us that we're human. And when we let ourselves be seen, flaws, fears, and all, we open the door to growth in a way that perfection never could. The truth is, we're all wired for self-protection. We avoid things that make us feel exposed because exposure feels risky. What if we fail? What if people judge us? What if we're not good enough? Those questions live rent-free in our heads, convincing us to stay small, to play it safe. But here's what I know. Every great thing I've done in my life has started with that exact feeling of fear. And every single time, the fear didn't go away before I acted. It only faded after I took the leap. I think about that moment in the workshop often, not because it changed my life overnight, but because it reminded me of something I'd forgotten. The only way to build courage is to practice it. You don't wake up one day suddenly brave. You wake up scared and you choose to act anyway. And the more you do it, the stronger that muscle gets. For me, that workshop wasn't just about writing. It was about proving to myself that I was capable of doing hard things, and that proof carried over into other parts of my life. It gave me the courage to have hard conversations I'd been avoiding, to set boundaries I'd been too afraid to enforce, and to say yes to opportunities even when I didn't feel ready. But let me be clear, building courage doesn't mean the fear disappears. Even now, there are days when I feel that familiar knot in my stomach, when my inner critic pipes up with its usual chorus of doubts. The difference is I've learned how to keep going anyway. I've learned to let the fear sit beside me without letting it take the wheel. What I've also learned is that courage isn't about doing things perfectly. It's about showing up imperfectly, knowing that the act of showing up is what matters most. It's about letting yourself be seen, even when it feels uncomfortable. And yes, sometimes you'll stumble. Sometimes people won't get it. Sometimes you'll fail. But every time you do, you'll also get stronger. I'll never forget the day I shared one of my pieces with the group in that workshop. My voice shook the entire time. And when I was done, I braced myself for criticism. But instead, one of the participants raised her hand and said, "Thank you. That story made me feel less alone." That's the thing about vulnerability. It's not just for us, it's for the people around us too. When we have the courage to show up as we are, we give other people permission to do the same. We create space for connection, empathy, and growth. And in a world that often feels isolating, that kind of courage matters more than ever. So if you're waiting for the fear to go away before you start, let me tell you this, you'll be waiting forever. Fear doesn't go away, it just gets quieter the more you practice facing it, and you don't need to take massive leaps to start building courage. You just need to take one small, brave step. Maybe it's speaking up in a meeting. Maybe it's sharing your work, your ideas, or your truth. Maybe it's simply raising your hand and saying, "I need help." Whatever it looks like, know this every time you choose to show up. Even when it's hard, you're rewriting the story you tell yourself about who you are. And the more you practice showing up, the more that story shifts. It stops being, "I'm not brave enough," and starts becoming, "I can do this." And that shift, that's where courage is born. Not in the absence of fear, but in the decision to keep moving forward with it. And when you do, something incredible happens. You start to see yourself differently. You start to trust yourself more. And eventually you realize that the courage you were looking for, it was there all along. You just had to give it the chance to show up. Let's be real, change comes with setbacks. You'll mess up, you'll fall short, you'll get rejected, and it's going to feel uncomfortable, maybe even unbearable at times. But here's what no one talks about those moments. They're not signs that you're failing. They're signs that you're in the middle of something that matters. Growth isn't smooth, it's gritty, awkward, and often painful. And that's why resilience matters so much. It's not about avoiding failure, it's about learning how to rise after it. I've always been fascinated by the idea of resilience. For a long time, I thought it was something other people were born with, people who seemed unshaken no matter what life threw at them. But what I've learned is that resilience isn't something you're born with, it's something you build. And the only way to build it is to face the hard things. I remember the first time I faced what felt like a big failure. I had poured my heart into a project, hours of work, late nights, and so much hope, and when I finally shared it, it flopped. Hard, the feedback wasn't just disappointing, it was devastating. I felt exposed, embarrassed, and ready to quit. My first instinct was to retreat, to hide, to convince myself that maybe this wasn't meant for me after all. But something stopped me. I sat down with the feedback, and instead of letting it define me, I asked myself a hard question. What can I learn from this? And that's where everything shifted. Instead of seeing failure as evidence that I wasn't good enough, I started to see it as evidence that I was trying, that I was in the arena, that I was doing the work most people are too afraid to even attempt. The truth is, resilience doesn't mean bouncing back instantly. It doesn't mean pretending the failure didn't hurt or brushing it off like it's no big deal. It means sitting with the discomfort, letting yourself feel the disappointment, and then deciding that it's not the end of the story. Resilience is about taking what hurt you and using it as fuel to move forward, not because you're ignoring the pain, but because you're learning from it. I think about the Japanese art of kintsugi, the practice of repairing broken pottery with gold. Instead of hiding the cracks, it highlights them, turning the flaws into something beautiful. That's what resilience does for us. It takes our cracks, the rejections, the failures, the missteps, and fills them with gold. It reminds us that what's broken isn't worthless. It's more valuable because it's been put back together. The moments when we feel broken are the moments when we have the most potential to grow. But growth doesn't happen by accident. It happens when we make the choice to keep going, even when it's hard. And sometimes that choice looks small, like getting out of bed after a hard day, sending one more email after a rejection, or trying again when you'd rather give up. But every one of those choices adds up. They build grit, they build confidence. And most importantly, they build trust, the kind of trust that says, I can handle this. I'll be honest, there were times when I didn't believe I could handle it. After that first big failure, there were days when I questioned whether I should even keep going. But every time I showed up, even when it felt pointless, I was teaching myself something important. I was proving to myself that failure wasn't final. And that belief, that's what resilience is built on. The hardest part of resilience is that it asks us to let go of perfection. It asks us to be willing to fail, not once, but over and over again. And that's scary, especially in a world that celebrates highlight reels and overnight success stories. But what we don't see in those stories are the moments behind the scenes, the rejections, the tears, the doubts. We don't see the nights spent questioning whether it's worth it, or the mornings spent picking yourself back up after falling short. But those moments, that's where the magic happens. That's where resilience is forged, not in the victories, but in the struggles that come before them. It's in the emails that don't get responses, the ideas that don't land, and the dreams that feel just out of reach. It's in the decision to keep showing up anyway, even when you don't know if it's going to work. I think back to that first failure often, not because it defined me, but because it refined me. It taught me to trust the process, to embrace the messiness of growth, and to stop measuring my worth by my results. And every failure since then has done the same thing. They've taught me to let go of what I can't control and focus on what I can, my effort, my mindset, and my willingness to keep trying. Because here's the truth, resilience isn't about being unshakable. It's about learning how to bend without breaking. It's about finding the courage to try again when you're tired, disappointed, or scared. And the more you practice it, the more you realize that failure isn't something to fear. It's something to use. When I look back at my journey, it's not the smooth parts that stand out. It's the moments I stumbled, the times I felt like quitting but didn't. It's the times I got knocked down and stood back up. Those are the moments that shape me. And those are the moments that will shape you too. So if you find yourself in the middle of a setback, if you feel like you've failed or fallen short, I want you to know this moment doesn't define you. What defines you is what you do next. Will you let it break you, or will you let it build you? Will you let it stop you, or will you let it fuel you? Resilience isn't built when everything is going right. It's built when everything feels wrong and you choose to keep going anyway. And when you do, you'll look back not just at how far you've come, but at the cracks filled with gold, and you'll realize those cracks are what made you stronger. Accountability is one of the most overlooked but transformative tools for change. It's also one of the hardest to embrace because, let's be honest, accountability means putting ourselves on the hook. It means making a commitment not just to ourselves, but often to other people, and risking the possibility of falling short. And that risk, it's uncomfortable, it's vulnerable. But it's also where real growth happens. I used to resist accountability. I thought if I kept my goals to myself, I could avoid the pressure of someone else knowing whether I followed through. It felt safer to keep things private because then, if I didn't succeed, no one else would know. But here's what I learned: when no one else knows your goals, it's too easy to let yourself off the hook. It's too easy to say, I'll start tomorrow, or this doesn't really matter. I saw this play out in my own life more times than I can count. The first, make promises to myself, whether it was starting a new workout routine, setting boundaries, or working toward a creative project, and the moment things got hard, I'd let it slide. And each time I did, I chipped away at my own self-trust. It wasn't just that I wasn't reaching my goals, it was that I stopped believing I could. But everything changed when I started letting other people in. I remember the first time I told a friend about one of my big goals. It wasn't even something earth-shattering. I just wanted to wake up an hour earlier to work on a project. But saying it out loud, that felt huge. I remember feeling this mix of excitement and fear because suddenly it wasn't just an idea floating around in my head. It was real. It existed outside of me, and that meant I couldn't just ignore it. And something incredible happened. That friend didn't just cheer me on, she checked in. She asked me how it was going. She held me accountable without judgment, and that support made all the difference. Knowing someone else cared about my progress gave me the push I needed to keep going, even on the days when motivation was nowhere to be found. What I realized is that accountability isn't about shame or guilt, it's about connection. It's about creating a system of support that reminds you you're not in this alone. Because let's be honest, change is hard. There are days when you'll feel inspired and unstoppable, and there are days when you'll feel stuck and defeated. Having someone to remind you why you started, to celebrate your wins, and to challenge you when you want to give up. That's priceless. But accountability isn't just about leaning on other people. It's also about being accountable to yourself. And that's often the hardest part, because how many times have we shown up for other people, kept our promises to them, and then completely abandoned the promises we made to ourselves? I know I've done it more times than I can count. And it's not because we're lazy or unmotivated. It's because keeping promises to ourselves often feels optional. There's no immediate consequence if we don't follow through. No one's watching. No one's keeping score. But here's the thing, every time we break a promise to ourselves, we reinforce the belief that our word doesn't matter, that we can't trust ourselves. And over time, that erodes our confidence in ways that ripple through every part of our lives. I'll never forget the first time I really took accountability for my own choices. It was a small moment. I decided to commit to journaling for 5 minutes every morning. That's it, just 5 minutes, but I treated it like it mattered. I wrote it down. I set reminders, and most importantly, I told myself this wasn't negotiable. And you know what? Those 5 minutes turned into 10, then 15. And before I knew it, that tiny commitment had become a habit. But more than that, it became evidence that I could trust myself again. It reminded me that when I set an intention, I could follow through. That's the power of accountability. It builds momentum. It shifts the story we tell ourselves about who we are and what we're capable of. And the more we practice it, the stronger that belief becomes. But let me be clear, accountability doesn't mean perfection. It doesn't mean you'll never miss a day or make a mistake. It means you're willing to own it when you do. It means being honest with yourself, not as a form of punishment, but as a way to learn and grow. There were days I missed my journaling sessions, days when I got busy or distracted and let myself off the hook. But instead of letting that spiral into guilt or shame, I asked myself, what can I do differently tomorrow? And that question, that simple act of reflection, helped me get back on track without beating myself up.